everybody. Welcome back. That was a quick break, wasn't it? Oh my gosh, I hope you made it to the restrooms that we found conveniently located in wherever they are located in your general vicinity, because we're online, right? So maybe you're at the coffee shop, maybe you're in your basement, maybe you're in your living room. Who knows? But man, what an exciting day we've been having, ladies and gentlemen. Let's keep our energy and focus going here. Talking to someone that I'm very interested to hear from today, Mr. Killian Hobbs. Killian Hobbs is a Canadian libertarian. He is a Canadian libertarian, and he is a writer and a podcaster, best known for his Bad Arguments series of articles. He's also the managing editor of Being Libertarian. We'll bring you online here, Mr. Hobbs. Welcome.
Hello. How are you doing today?
Fantastic, sir. Welcome to Taxation Is Theft Fest 2020. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and look forward to what you have to share with us today. So, without further ado, I'll turn the screen over to you. I'll still be here if you need me, but I'll turn the screen over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So basically for today, I'll just go through a few things for how to argue. That's the main topic that I'm here for. I find that quite often when it comes to libertarian discussions, when it comes to just general human interaction, one of the weaker points that people seem to have is how to argue effectively, how to do so in a way that's actually going to accomplish something rather than just getting blood boiled on both sides, and how to actually craft an argument that's going to hold up under scrutiny. So just to give some background for my qualifications on this, I'm the managing editor, as was mentioned, for Being Libertarian, which covers beinglibertarian.com, think-liberty.com, and the South African publication rationalstandard.com. The podcast that I host is Coffee Shop Philosophy, and as was mentioned, I did the Bad Arguments series of articles, as well as I have a forthcoming book where the pre-order is live now, a book called Bad Arguments, A Guide to Logic and Winning Debates. Some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here is going to be stuff from the book, other things are just personal experience, anecdotes, different things like that, so that I can try to break down how I look at argumentation and how you can use some of that information to be a little more effective when you're trying to argue with others or trying to have discussions with others to get them to see your side of the point or your side of the debate. So I like to break this into three basic categories: knowing the game itself, knowing who you're debating against, and then knowing yourself. Normally I organize this a little bit differently, but I think that it'll be, for this type of environment, a little more effective if I start off with the game aspect. So when it comes to knowing the game of a debate or of an argument, the first thing you need to know is whether you're in a debate or in an argument. It sounds strange that because the terms are usually used in an interchanged way, but there actually is a very key difference. So when you're in a debate, it's a little more formal, a little more civil, a little more point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint, usually a lot more structured. These are the sort of things that you see with actual planned debates where you have people come on podcasts and then you have the two people going back and forth. There's moderation. There's a lot more structure to what would be considered an actual debate. The majority of us don't get into debates, though. Very rarely are you going to talk to someone who completely disagrees with you on a certain topic, and you're going to have that kind of moderated point counterpoint type of discussion. It's just not the reality of modern human interaction with each other. Most of the interactions we have where we discuss these topics, they'll be, you have friends over at a bar and a topic comes up and you go back and forth. You're going to be in an argument with a family member or a spouse, or most commonly, you're going to be online going back and forth on a Twitter thread or a Facebook thread or something like that, having just back and forth with the person without any type of real structure to it. So I'm going to be focusing on the argument side because there's been thousands and thousands of things written about just debating in and of itself in that formal setting, but that doesn't really apply to the majority of us out here. So one of the first things to know that I find is a very common mistake for people that start to learn argumentation, which is when to call out a fallacy. So what you'll see a lot when it comes to arguments is someone will learn what an ad hominem is, and then every time they see an insult, they'll just throw that, oh, ad hominem, you must be wrong. They'll just throw that out there to try to shut down the argument. Or they'll study a whole bunch of different fallacies, which it's a good thing to have that knowledge and to be aware of it. Don't get me wrong when I say that. But they'll just throw these different types of fallacies out to try to say, okay, so you must have done this, you got this wrong, so therefore my point's right, I don't need to try anymore. When you do this, you come across in a very negative light for anyone that might be observing the discussion, or even to your opponent who may have been a little more amiable when it comes to hearing your points. So if your goal is to just simply dunk on a person and make sure that they're, looked at as wrong, maybe pointing out a lot of these fallacies might help you get there and calling them out by name. If you're just there to toot your own horn, then sure, shouldn't be one of the reasons you get into arguments, but every once in a while you will, so I'm not going to judge on that. But if your purpose is to convert the audience of people that might be watching this discussion, like people that might be scrolling through the chat back and forth if you're on social media having this discussion, or if you're trying to focus your attention on just converting that person, when you call out these types of fallacies, you have to be sure to do it in a way that's palatable to them or palatable to the type of audience that you're dealing with. I'll use a good example for this. Let's use the gun debate, right? We all know the gun right debate. Anyone that's watching a stream called Taxation Is Theft, I'm sure is well aware of the kinds of back and forths that happen when it comes to the gun debate. So normally you'll hear a lot of just personal attacks that'll come from people that are on the anti-gun side. They'll say, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't care. You don't care if children are dying in schools. You don't care if, 10,000 people are killed each day, et cetera, et cetera. You'll hear all these different types of attacks, but they'll be making a bunch of pleas to emotionalism. They'll be making appeals to authority. They'll be attacking you personally, which is the ad hominem, which if you're just kind of sitting back and just throwing these different Latin phrases at them, you're not going to change their minds. And the goal should be to change their mind or to bring them to your side to see where you're coming from. So that's one of those situations where the approach is not going to work. Now, you can call out something being wrong. You can say, no, it's not a matter of that. It's a matter of people's individual rights. It's a matter of personal defense and the potential lives lost from a lack of personal defense. It's a matter of, not it being a need, but the fact that it being a need, like the fact that it's a right, doesn't depend on whether or not it's a need for someone to be able to purchase a firearm and have one in their house or on their person. You don't need to push on what would be the normal talking points for your side. You need to dissect where they're coming from and what they're trying to say, and use that to build a case to bring them to your side. And that's when I say you got to watch pulling out these fallacy cards, when you just start learning all these different things. That's when you want to kind of take a step back and really observe the game, because it might win you the small battle in that moment, but it's going to lose you the long-term game. The next part about the game itself is just some basic game theory. Now, I could go on for hours about game theory in and of itself, especially when it comes to argumentation, but I'll keep it very simple for our purposes here. One of the key aspects of game theory is the concept of initiative. So what I mean here is there's usually only two states that you can be in any type of a game. And an argument is no different than a game in general to begin with. When you're in a discussion, you're either the person with the initiative, so the person who's setting the tone, starting the debate, moving things forward the way that you want them to, or you're the person reacting to the moves of the other person. Now, debates are a little interesting because there's usually you're making your move and a counter move at the same time. You're disproving what they're saying and then saying something to reiterate your point to put them on the defensive. It's important to know where you're at when you're in an argument with someone so that you can see how to flip it back over to you having the control. I'll go back to the gun debate example for this. So you can go in and just say, it's a right, I stand by it, I should be able to have that. It's a constitutional right, the Constitution says I should be able to do this. You can use different points like that as your initial foray into the argument. But at that point, the other person can say, okay, great, it's a part of the Constitution, but the Constitution's just a law and it could be changed like any other. There's already been amendments that have been added and subtracted in the course of the history of the Constitution. Therefore, your argument's wrong, and the fact that you're leaning on that just tells me you care more about guns than lives. Now, before anyone blows up in the comments, I completely and utterly disagree with that sentiment, but I'm using that as an example of something that will most likely be thrown at you if that's your approach, is to just lean solely on the constitutional argument or solely on the rights argument. Because the people that are against these rights, they don't care about that aspect. They could not care less. So that first little blow towards them, they'll just brush off, push aside, and they'll retake that initiative and then start going after you about lives lost or about public safety or about this, that, or the next thing. You can take a bit of a different approach when you have the initiative in that kind of argument. So you could say something to the effect of, I believe that people should be able to have guns to defend themselves, both against a potential tyrannical government, as we've seen in other nations in the world and throughout history, and because in a lot of situations, the current response time for police and other types of security forces simply isn't sufficient to make sure that lives can be protected. When you use a statement like that to start off a gun rights debate, first off, you're pushing aside any arguments they might be able to make that are from an emotional basis. So it's not a matter of you not caring about lives. The whole purpose of your argument is to protect lives because the current systems aren't able to. We know that a 30-minute police response time is not going to protect your family's lives if you have an immediately dangerous situation. We know that time and time again throughout history, governments have become tyrannical, which is one of the reasons why this amendment existed in the first place. By using this type of approach, you can throw multiple points out. You're throwing out counterpoints in advance because you already know the kind of general moves they're going to make, and you've already shut them down. So that limits the kind of arguments that they can throw against you at that point. Because if they're throwing the lives lost thing, well, you've already said it's not a matter of lives lost. That part isn't an aspect of it. It's a matter of protecting lives. You've already covered that. If they start to go into things such as, let's say, the school shooting statistics, one, you can go into the counter statistics, which really show that it's a very minimalistic number considering the population that the US has, or other countries comparative to the total shootings that they have. You can take a look at that and say, well, most people are dying of the regular flu or falling out of their bed in the morning. It's not as drastic of a thing as it seems. You can use these types of counterpoints down the road, but at this point you've taken the initiative because you've shut down their early jabs. An important part too when it comes to the game itself is intellectual self-defense. So I'm pretty sure people can probably relate to this, where you've been in a discussion with someone, you just chime in on a topic that you happen to see while you're scrolling through Facebook, let's say. You just kind of chime in on the topic and you get into a back and forth with someone, not really an argument yet, not really a debate, none of that sort of stuff, but you get into that back and forth with them and it starts to feel like you're losing. And what I mean there is, you're just throwing points out there, but they are shutting them down, dismissing you as just, being crazy or not understanding what you're talking about, doing the whole, okay, well, that makes no sense, but go ahead. Let's hear where this goes. Little tactics like that. An important thing when it comes to intellectual self-defense is to be able to recognize those and then be able to plan for them. So whether it's sophistry, straight up personal attacks against you, or a personal favorite tactic I love seeing people use online where they post thesis long comments in an attempt to just wear you out so that you're not able to address everything that they're saying. Whether they use any of these types of tactics or even a ton of other ones that exist that I go into in a bit more detail in the book there, you want to make sure that you're able to recognize them and be able to either call them out, which a lot of people for some reason in arguments are afraid to call out bad tactics. So if someone is just doing the whole dismissive, well, that part sounds crazy, I don't quite get it, but you know what, go ahead. If they're doing something like that, you can just stop and say, okay, you keep dismissing what I'm saying, so obviously you're not interested in hearing it. If you're actually interested in hearing it, we can continue. If not, then why don't you get to your point and we can move on. If they're being rude and going through personal attacks, you can brush them off and then summarize them at the end, simply saying, okay, you've called me this, you've said that, you've done this, you've said that, you've done this, you've said that, but you haven't actually contributed anything to the discussion. So does that mean you think I'm right? Those little slaps to the face can really reset the argument, because at that point, you'll know if the person is literally just trying to troll you, in which case, honestly, unless you have a really vested interest in doing something about the person, you don't need to waste your time on it, which is probably the most important part of any type of self-defense, is knowing when not to fight. If you don't need to have that particular debate or that particular argument with that one person, then you don't need to give them your time. You don't need to waste that emotional labor on them simply because some random with an anime Facebook profile decided that they wanted to call you out on your stance on taxation in the 1930s and its relation to depression. You don't need to put your time into that discussion unless you personally think you're going to be able to get something out of it. And I find that that's a point that a lot of people forget when they get into these, is they just get their blood up, they start going back and forth. But like any other game, once you get your blood up and you stop paying attention to the type of moves you're making and you stop planning what you're trying to say, at that point, if the other opponent has a cooler head, you've lost. The next part that I'll get into, because I mentioned there was 3 here, the next part is knowing the person you're discussing with, so the person you're talking to. Some things to look for with this are things such as the argument styles that they're using. So you can look into, are they arguing from a purely tribalistic perspective? And what I mean by tribalistic is sometimes people will argue for their camp, and they will not pay attention to any kind of cognitive dissonance that they're performing in the course of their argument. They're not going to pay attention to any counterpoints. They're going to wait for you to finish speaking so they can just keep speaking on their point and trying to hammer it out. You could be saying something that they completely agree with, but because you're saying it from the other side, they'll refuse to acknowledge the validity of that point in relation to the actual discussion you're having, if there's even the slightest shimmer that it could mean something negative for their side. A good example of this in recent days is the back and forth about different types of sexual harassment between Biden and Trump. That's a perfect example of it, where both sides are willing to say, well, our guy, ignore what's happening with our guy. However, that other guy, ooh. You see those kinds of back and forths constantly. One personal example I use of this is back from the 2016 election. This is, I think, is just one of the funnier examples that I've had of this in years past. So during the 2016 election, if people remember, there was an entire controversy about Donald Trump making fun of a disabled reporter. That was the way the story went. There's the picture where he's going around, he's got the arm hooked up and everything like that. And the whole story, the whole narration was that he was making fun of the disabled reporter. So I decided to look into it a little more, because I was thinking, okay, Trump's done a lot of weird stuff, but going after someone for their disability, that seems a little too far even for that guy. So I take a look into the story a little bit more, and I find that the flailing of the arms around was something that he had done 2 or 3 times prior and twice after as a way of mocking people for being flustered. And he did that while also making fun of, there was 2 other reporters and a congressman that he had made fun of in the course of the whole thing. And he was going after the original guy because they had to retract half of a piece that he had originally published. So one is he had done it before and after. 2, the reporter, the name escapes me at the moment, but the reporter's disability meant that his arms were locked in place, which means the flailing wouldn't really have made much sense anyway. So in looking into it, I decided to just take this argument and see where it went with both camps, so to speak. So in talking to Republicans about it, they jumped on it. They jumped on it like like soy sauce on rice. They wanted to say, yes, 100%, this proves it. My guy's clear. He's good. He's great. Obviously nothing wrong here. Awesome. Bring it over to the Democrats, and obviously I'm a bootlegger. I'm a bigot. I don't care about this group, that group, the next group, simply because I dared to say something potentially redeeming about Trump. Now, this is where the argument goes a step further, because I wanted to see the change in opinions. We could hold that original argument has its validity, let's say, but when we're talking about the position of the presidency of the United States, a person running for president, flailing their arms about as a way to mock people on national stages is exceedingly childish and unprofessional. So if you bring that side of it up, I brought up the argument that it mainly didn't go anywhere because the core aspect was wrong, because it wasn't about the disability. It shouldn't have been that key point they dove in on. It should have been the lack of professionalism. It should have been the childish antics of a 70-odd-year-old man running for president of the United States. When I brought this argument up to Republicans, I got the immediate 180. They liked the first bit, but they didn't care about any of it simply because I ended the argument off by saying that he had acted unprofessionally and childish. I got arguments ranging from, that's why we like him, from, oh, you're just some pinko, it's this, that, the next thing, just stay up in Canada, shut your mouth, all the normal stuff. When I brought that argument over to the Democrats just to say, hey, so this is how I take the situation, their response on everything was still 100% negative, because they refused to give up that point on the identity politics. They almost needed it to be about the disability. They refused to accept it as a professionalism issue or about a behavioral issue. They needed it to be the disability issue. So even when I was saying these other negative things, they didn't want to hear it either, because they didn't want to give up that initial point. So you'll see there's positives and negatives to dealing with people who are very tribalistic in their arguments. The positives of it are that they're easy to read. If you find out their stance on, if someone says, I'm a Democrat and I'm anti-gun, you already know their stance on abortion, you know their stance on taxation, you know their stance on business regulations. And those are all completely unrelated things, but you shouldn't be able to. If people were actually thinking their arguments through and trying to build a good solid base for themselves, where they can say that they have no cognitive dissonance, all of their core beliefs match up with the things they argue for and against, as well as the methods they use to argue for and against it, or the certain policies they believe in or economic systems they think are superior. If people were more consistent with it, then you wouldn't have all of these jumps all over the place, and it would honestly be harder to read because you wouldn't expect that kind of camp thinking. So one of the first things to learn is that argumentative style that people have in those camps, whether it's the tribalistic, so you already know, the stickers on the can, it tells you exactly what's going to be inside for when Democrats try to argue towards you, or when Republicans are trying to argue towards you, or people who identify as anarcho-communists or syndicalists, mutualists, whatever. You'll be able to tell because there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, a lot of tropes in their argumentation style. And usually within 2 or 3 exchanges with a person in general, you can find out, are they the ones to give you a long-winded, multi-page response? Are they the ones to just say, no, this part's wrong, here's why it's wrong, and this is my point again? Or are they going to try to go at it from a different angle? And when you're reading your opponent and trying to figure out where they're coming from and who they are, being able to pick up on those different styles and learning about those different styles will benefit you greatly in being able to tailor your responses and your initial approach to either bring them over towards your side or bring their audience over, or at least get them to realize aspects of what they're saying is wrong. Even if you can't convert them fully, if you can get them to stop using bad arguments for their side that you're sick and tired of hearing, then at least that's a positive for you. Another thing that I find is really useful when you get into those types of arguments is trying to mirror the person you're dealing with. So one thing, and this is common for any discussion, this isn't a debate thing, this isn't an argumentation thing, this is a basic human interaction, art of conversation thing. When you're talking to someone, trying to match their tone, trying to match their body language. If they're super excited about something, there's nothing wrong with sharing that excitement and talking to them in that same excited tone until it goes a little too far and you got to reel them back. But if someone's approach on you is very, well, this is the way that I see it, then taking a slower, measured approach isn't a bad option. Because if you're talking too fast or you're just talking over them, then you're not really going to be connecting with them. People find reassurance in finding people who speak similarly to them, people who have a more measured approach, or at least the measuring matches their own. Because if they see that the other person matches the way that they speak or some of their body language or actions or wordings or phrases, they're going to take that as a sign that the person probably thinks like they do. In which case, just subconsciously, people assume the person at that point is more trustworthy. You'll see that particular piece of advice in anything related to human interaction, whether it's books on how to sell, books on how to get promotions in your work, on debating skills, on argumentation, on conversations with people. It's such a core skill that's very hard to transfer into the online world, despite the fact that everything they're saying and the way they're saying it is written right there for you to read and read over to be able to respond in kind. It's almost easier to pick up on those cues in pure speech, in pure written format, than it is to try to respond when you're actually having to pick up on a whole bunch of body cues that you may not be practiced in, or you just may be reading wrong. There's tons of examples of people picking up the wrong kind of signals from someone else. I mean, I don't think there was a comedy in the 80s that wasn't based on that being a key focal point in the first 15 minutes of it. But that's a skill, especially through text, that's very difficult, but it's one that's very important to learn. Again, if you're going to be able to convert people to your side. The last thing, as far as just knowing the opponent you're dealing with or the person you're talking to, is really getting into their root issue. I'll go back to the gun debate. So, if someone is against guns, if they are anti-gun, they want guns banned, they want them restricted, or anything like that, it's important to find out why. So, are they going after it because they are simply against them and they find them a fearful item? Are they against it because they see the school shootings and it's an emotional issue and they say, not one child, and that's kind of their approach to it? You got to really dig in to try to get to their root reason for being for or against something, because nobody has a really impassioned stance about a certain policy or about a certain aspect of the economy. No one's going to be really impassioned and really just, oh yes, I can't wait to see, Bill 76305 pass. People aren't like that. What they care about is what it stands for, what those things mean. So if they are, anti-gun, it's good to find out why. What is the part that's making them be against it? Are they against it because they find that there's, a risk of loss of life? Well, there's a risk of loss of life if people are unable to defend themselves. And it acts as an equalizer, because we see with, just differences in, body sizes and things like that. If we go back to just the strong win, then at that point, a whole bunch of other people are going to be in potential danger. With the existence of guns, it equalizes that. You don't have that problem anymore. That's just one example. There's tons others, I'm sure, but you can really try to dig in with the person and try to establish what it is they want to accomplish. Because if they want to accomplish let's say a full gun ban, they don't want to accomplish that solely because they want to ban guns. It's because there's an aspect of what guns do, or what certain people owning guns do, that they have a problem with. And if you can take the time to find out what that problem is while you're having the discussion with them, then you're going to be in a better place to address that root cause. Because if you can deal with that core issue, then the side issues that come out of it, like their stances on regulations or policy, they're going to simply evaporate with no core root to work from. A good example outside of the gun debate of this, of course, would be people who are anti-capitalism. When you take a look at people who are anti-capitalism, there's usually a large variety of core reasons why they're against it. Maybe they're against it because they had economic downturns of their own and they don't like a system where they can find themselves in a state of poverty. Simple solution. At that point, you're going to start arguing about freeing up the market, making it easier for a person to go and earn their own living, getting rid of the restrictions and regulations and taxations and all of the other barriers that stop a person from being able to climb themselves out from the gutter and being able to succeed entirely on their own merits. If it's a matter of people worried about the safety net aspect of it and they dislike that part of it, then you can talk about private charities. You can talk about how, with people having a larger access to wealth that a truly laissez-faire market would create, then people are going to be able to develop these, aid networks for each other. They're going to be able to set up these things and help each other. If you're just going at it as, well, this is the way it should be because this is my right and nobody should have access to my money, unless people are already thinking that way, you're not going to change any minds. And ultimately, if you're going to get into any kind of argument with anyone, changing their minds should be your primary goal, or at the very least, their audience. And this takes me kind of to the last part, which is really knowing yourself when it comes to entering into a debate. Because one of the worst things that you can do is walk into a discussion and find yourself with your pants down, right? That's the worst thing you can do. You'll have a small tidbit worth of knowledge, you'll jump into the discussion, and then someone who's well-versed on the topic will completely trounce you. And you might be right. You could have very little information, and your stance or your position could still technically be the correct one. But because you haven't equipped yourself to be able to deal with that, it's going to fall flat on your face, and the person who's technically wrong is going to look as if what they're saying is right. So a good thing to start off with is asking yourself why you're arguing. And it's important to be honest with yourself about this one instead of arguing in bad faith. So it's good to say, well, I'm going to enter this conversation because I'm sick and tired of people using this one argument. It needs to be shut down. That's a valid reason. This person's generally really smart, and I don't know why they keep taking this stance on it. I'd like to be able to make them understand what they're getting wrong. That's a perfectly valid reason to argue. If a person, let's say they're some kind of talking head that has a large audience of a whole bunch of people that just eat up their every word, like a Glenn Beck type, let's say, and you decide, I just want to get into that argument and show the audience of his people what he gets wrong. And it could be any talking head that you want. I'm just the first one that came to my mind. Nothing particularly for or against him, just random one. But you need to pick what it is that you're entering that argument for, because that'll tell you how you need to approach it. It'll need to tell you how hard you need to go or when you need to take a soft touch. And it'll tell you when it stops being worth your time. Because there's no reason to spend 7 hours of your day going back and forth on the same thread on social media, having an argument with someone that isn't going anywhere. Because either they're just not understanding what you're saying, they're refusing to understand what you're saying, they are completely ignoring any points or counterpoints and just going into attack after attack after attack. You're wasting your time at that point. There's no reason to waste that energy. So when you know what you're arguing for, that'll help you decide how much effort and what type of approach you need really to approach that argument. Another one is consistent ideals. One of the things we see constantly is different callouts for cognitive dissonance. So this is when people hold two completely separate ideas that clash with each other, and yet they somehow think that both are valid. I like to think of it more like doublethink from George Orwell's 1984. I find that's a bit more of a valid comparison for the way that a lot of people use this information. So it's important to take a step back and review what you stand for and why. So if you say, I stand for freedom, okay, great. What kind of freedom? How are you defining freedom? What is it about freedom that you think is morally superior to a structured society that has, extra controls, so on and so forth? If you can answer these questions for yourself, which I'm sure that most people, if they actually assess their own beliefs, would end up on the side of, freedom and most likely just the elimination of the government and all the horrors it completes. But that's beside the point. If you take the time to actually review what you stand for, why you stand for it, and apply that in any argument you pick up or any point you decide to defend, you won't have those moments of cognitive dissonance. You won't have those moments where you're caught saying, oh, wait, what? That doesn't mean, what? You're not going to have those moments. It's not going to be a thing that happens to you. So I'll loop back to the gun debate. I'll keep using that as an example because it's a great example. If you're on obviously the pro-gun side, which I'm assuming the vast majority of people that are watching this are, if you're on the pro-gun side, then that means that you're going to be saying, okay, why do I support guns? Is it simply because it's a right? Is it because it's a natural right? Is it because it's a constitutional right? Is it because the government should have no say on the things that I own? What's again, that root cause? What is that reason that you support it? Because that'll tell you what parts you can abandon. So if there's a certain recommendation for policy, you can say whether or not it's worth recommending or worth talking about. You can say why you disagree with these counterpoints instead of falling into tribalism of they said something anti-gun, I'm against it. When you have that understanding of yourself going into the debate, you have much surer stances. You are in a much better place and you're much more balanced when you're trying to defend the things that you believe and care about. Because once you've defined them and actually worked that out into all of your different arguments and all the different things that you stand for, you're going to eliminate all of those weak points. Well, at least eliminate them as much as you can without actively studying into each of those topics. Because it's always good to back yourself up with actual information and actually knowing some of the facts related to the things you stand for. The last thing that I'll talk about here, and this is kind of a more back towards knowing the game itself, which is a system that I personally use when I'm trying to get to the root cause of it or trying to have a discussion with someone, which is trying to categorize the issues. So a good example, and a lot of people are going to sound a little strange to people, but the gun debate is something I would probably call a D-class issue. It's not an A-class top of the end, like top problem issue, because it's an issue that goes away if you solve the issue that's causing it. So when it comes to the gun debate, let's say that when it comes to that, we're not really discussing, certain policies, this, that, and the next thing. It's flared up because of, let's say there's a recent school shooting. It's recently was the, I think it was recently the anniversary for Parkland or pretty close, but regardless, let's say it's a school shooting that kicked everything off. And that's why that's why the gun debate has reignited for pro and against. We just had the same issue up here in Canada where Trudeau, in his infinite wisdom, decided to put a ban on 1,500 different guns. We just had that whole debate up here, and unfortunately, our side lost. But let's say that's what sparks this debate again, with people going back and forth. When it comes to that debate, the debate itself is the D-class issue. The C-class issue is the loss of life. The C-class issue is people saying, okay, so is there a cost of life or a situation or like a lifeboat situation, as they're normally referred to in arguments, where we are able to say yes or no on a certain right? That's the C-class issue, is whether or not that the debate is even valid, considering what might cause it. When we go from there, the C-class issue becomes we reach the B-class issue, the one that predicates that, which is there ever a time for us to be able to put rights on hold? Is there ever an example where we can say no to rights? If there isn't, then the debates for C-class and D-class are done. They're over with. They're gone. They're no longer part of the problem. Because if we answer no to that B-class debate, then we don't need to waste our time asking whether or not we should restrict guns, because obviously the answer is no, because we've already agreed, no, rights should not be restricted. When we go from the B class to the A class, that's when we get into an argument about the actual nature of rights and what defines them, where they come from, so on and so forth. If you take the stance that rights are solely from the Constitution, that leaves a weak point where the Constitution is amendable, as I mentioned earlier during this. If you're taking it as the natural right approach, then you need to be able to argue and justify the concept of natural rights. You could even take the social evolution theory that F.A. Hayek uses for defining how rights and societal norms come about, whatever purpose you take. But you'll end up having a better argument or a better discussion if you're able to take that step towards those root problems. So not necessarily the root issue for just your opponent, but the root issue for the actual issue itself, as complicated and terrible of a sentence as that was. But one of the things with that is if you can take the core issue, if you can get to there from the debate and you can say, okay, so I can see that, you've got the stance on this and you're advocating this policy because you believe in XYZ. And the reason you believe in it is because of this. So why don't we discuss that for now? And we can start to move it towards those root arguments, because if you can prove your ground in those A-class problems, the B, the C, the D, the E, all the way down, depending on how convoluted of a discussion you're having, all of them will disappear. And the person you're dealing with, the person you're debating, the arguing with, they're not going to be able to really counter anything if they've agreed with you on that core premise. So that's something that I just recommend that everyone tries when they're having discussions with people, is to try to see where is it that this discussion can go, why is it getting there, and how can we take that moment and say, okay, let's loop back, let's try to address this first, because we're just going to be spinning our wheels on who believes in what policy here and there if we don't do something about this problem first. There's tons more that I could probably say about this, but I know my time is limited here. So I believe at this point we should be probably opening the floors up to any questions or any comments, anything that you guys have to say or want to add to this.
Man, Killian, you really you brought your A game for us today, which is fantastic. I was hiding off in the wings, letting you have your screen, and I was kind of watching some of the comments. Not a lot of some people have brought up some valid arguments, some things that could be talked about and argued points. But I think what we want to, one of the things that stood out to me was your conversation specifically about engaging people in arguments online. Because it's something we see all more prevalent. It's not like the good old days where you used to meet in the pub and have a good hearty conversation. Now it's the keyboard warriors sitting behind the keyboards and calling out. What advice do you have for people that are not in a position to utilize some of those interpersonal skills that we have access to when we're in person, which is mirroring and those type of behaviors, as far as matching body language, matching tone, matching pace? You can't do those things online, right? So how do you
sort of. You can't necessarily do the body language aspects online, of course, because you're not physically seeing them or having that kind of those cues that you can pick up on. But when people write, they almost always write with a sort of signature to it. There's a way that people write, a way that they phrase things. There'll be certain aspects to their writing that you can pick up on, just the same as you can body cues. So you're going to have a completely different view of someone that writes out the sentence. Let me think of something randomly here. If someone writes down the argument saying that I believe in the freedom that we should all be able to possess the firearms, just to keep that theme going. We should be able to possess firearms for the sake of the safety of our friends, family, and nation. Versus someone who just responds with, I think we should have guns because it's none of your damn business.
Yeah.
When you see those types of comments, you're going to get an idea of where the person's coming from, what kind of a mindset they have when they made the comment, or what they're aiming for. If they're already doing like 3 paragraphs in, then you're going to tell that they're vested in it, and they're probably going to try to come across a little more civilly, rather than they're going to be less likely to go after you personally or try to do a whole bunch of attacks. But as you have that back and forth, you can start reading their comments and saying, okay, so what kind of mindset would I need to be in to write something like this? Why would I look at it this way? Why would I, what would make someone say these particular things or take the time to break this down? It'll give you an idea of how interested they are in the discussion, whether they're taking it with a very casual tone, a very aggressive tone, a very laid back, hey, let's see where this goes tone. You can kind of pick that up, not as well, of course, as an in-person discussion, but you could try to pick those certain things up, especially since most online discussions usually don't happen only once. Because of either people liking each other on Facebook feeds, on Twitter feeds, people being in the same Facebook groups for either debate groups or they both follow the same person or whatever else, there's a lot of people online that you may not actually know, but you're going to constantly run into. I mean, I haven't physically met any of the people that I work with at Being Libertarian. There's about 30 or 40 of us between writers, memers, other podcasters, some of the people that do some of the management and IT stuff in the background. I've met, that's a bit of a lie, I've met one of them in person, and that's because, well, I'm in a different country, so I don't really get the chance to interact with a whole bunch of them. But you build those relationships and those conversations almost purely online just from the way that people talk to each other. You know, you can tell when someone's starting to be a little more agitated because of the way they're writing, or you can tell that someone is, you know, just having a laugh and they're not actually like vested in the conversation. So you can take a bit more of a casual approach when you're talking to them. It takes a lot more than just one interaction to pick up on those. But once you get used to the idea of looking for tone in writing, which most people should be pretty familiar with just from the existence of text messaging, where if you know the people in real life and then you see how they write, you can kind of put two and two together that, oh, this type of writing style means this type of person. You can use those as examples to try to hone in on how you pick up on that writing language, so to speak.
Interesting. Yeah. So you do. I guess that makes a lot of sense that you're picking up on tone based on for lack of a better term, how much intent they put in their language. Mm-hmm. The words that they're choosing and the amount of words they're choosing and the order of the words that they're choosing. But it requires some additional thinking. You kind of have to set that emotional component aside, right? And that's something that when you're in an argument or in a debate scenario, you really have to forget the emotion, right? You kind of have to leave that off, and the minute you get angry, it's over.
Yeah, and it's important to remember there's a fine line between anger and passion. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being passionate about what you're discussing. But as soon as you let it turn into anger about what you're discussing, where you start to lose control and you just start to just hammer in because you're feeling overwhelmed on it, at that point, if the other person has the ability to stop and go, they can step in and you'll lose. It goes back to the game theory idea. The thing with game theory, as interesting as it is, and as much as I do recommend anyone who's interested in any kind of maneuverings, whether it's economic, political science, debate and argumentation, all of it relies on some form of game theory in the back end. The only problem with game theory is that it relies on the idea that all actors are rational in most of the examples that are used. This is why Keynesian economics works great on paper, not so much in practice. This is the same thing with a lot of the regulatory ideas and different things like that. A lot of the things that we have against the existence of government, you will see that they are basing it on the idea that people are going to act and react in very specific ways, but that isn't reality. It just doesn't reflect how people actually are and how they view these things. But yeah, when it comes to looping back to the main point, when it comes to the game theory thing, one of the most important parts of any type of strategic game, which theoretically that's exactly what argumentation is throwing your opponent off balance. If you can break the person's concentration and break their chain of thinking, you can overtake even grandmasters at chess if they are not able to actually think and strategize and act appropriately 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves ahead.
Yeah.
If you're just doing it move by move, step by step, just waiting for responses, then at that point you're on the reactionary and you've completely lost the initiative in that conversation, which means the other person gets to decide where you're going simply by directing the conversation and just steamrolling it the way they want to put you into a corner that might be completely unrelated to what you were originally talking about. But if they can prove you wrong there, then all of a sudden it looks like you were wrong the whole chain back.
Yeah, it's interesting. You just made me think of Johnny Cochran. That's look over here. He didn't do it. The distraction mentality. Yep. Mr. Killian Hobbs, you have been very informative, very insightful. tell us once again, where can we find you and your articles?
Well, there's quite a few places. I'm spread a little thin, so to speak. But the best place to follow anything from me is just by searching Killian Hobbs author on Facebook. I'll post all the links to any articles I write on beinglibertarian.com, think-liberty.com, Rational Standard, or anywhere else. You'll also see updates and links for the forthcoming book I have, which is Bad Arguments, a guide to logic and winning debates. That comes out on July 4th, but pre-orders are live now for the digital copy. And there's also, you'll see different posts and links and stuff for that for the upcoming documentary Monopoly on Violence that I was actually hired to do some of the writing and narration for. So you'll get to hear my lovely voice again during that. And that comes out, I do believe, May 31st. So I'll obviously post about all that sort of stuff and anything else I end up involved in on there.
Cool. Awesome, sir. Well, thank you so much for joining us for Taxation Is Theft Fest 2020. Maybe we'll see you at the next one. Yeah, maybe we'll all get together in person, and you'll actually get to meet people in person. All right.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on, and I hope that everyone in the audience gets to enjoy the rest of the show.
Right on. Take care.
Take care, guys.
All right, everybody. Wow, that was great, and I think it's something that's all relatable, something that we can all kind of connect with. We've all been in scenarios where we've had conversations where we don't always agree 100% with what we're talking, who we're talking with, or what we're talking about. He gave us some really good insights on how we can maybe change some minds, maybe open some people up to consider some other options. Definitely encourage you guys to look into that a little bit further. We got a lot of stuff coming up still tonight, folks. Coming up next year at the top of the hour, we've got Josh Dial, which someone has told me that he has some kind of association with some kind of Netflix sensation show that may or may not have had some popularity. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with it, so we'll see how that goes. But I'll be sticking around to host for Josh Dial. So stay tuned, folks. Don't go anywhere. And here, I appreciate it. We'll see you soon.